So there is a DAO that we created some months ago. It's called NGO, and it tries to mimic how a nonprofit will work on a blockchain, for example. So you have multiple apps. You have apps like a token manager that lets you create tokens, and these tokens can represent from something like membership to a group to having like governance rights over the decentralized organization, to use like just having a token that does something. Like tokens can be whatever you give them access or right to be. Then you have like voting, which I think is the core of a decentralized organization. Voting or some kind of governance mechanism is really how a decentralized organization manifests its will. And then you have like, you can have like a vault basically where a decentralized organization has or owns assets. And then at the core, if we really think about a decentralized organization and what it is a set of rules. It is a set of rights that some entities have over the organization. So an example of that would be that in a DAO, for example, in the DAO, people had access to proposing some proposals that would give them access to funds to do things. So that's a permission, right? That's something that you give to a user or to an entity, and this entity has permission, has the right to, for example, propose something, and if that proposal goes forward through a voting system, they can withdraw funds. That's an example of like a very basic right. But generally speaking, an organization is just that. It's just like a set of permissions. It can be a hierarchy, but it doesn't have to be a one. It can be whatever kind of organization. It can look like a hierarchy. It can look like something horizontal, or it can look just like a graph, right? So you have an entity, for example, you have a voting app that has permissions to withdraw funds from finance, and then you have a token manager which has permission to open a voting. And therefore, what you have there is a decentralized organization that enables token holders of this decentralized organization to propose votings to withdraw funds. That's like a super, super simple example of a decentralized organization. And this is the Aragon UI and how it could look like. You can go to app.aragon.org if you want to check it out. I will not go into Aragon so much because I just want to cover like DAOs in a very generic and holistic way. But I just wanted for you guys to put a face, well, not a face, but just like a, like a UI to what a DAO is. So I will go into principles of what a DAO really is. So there are a few principles in which we can say that a DAO is a DAO. One of them is a DAO exists, and it exists until it decides to do so. No one can really take away the fact that a DAO is a DAO, not a government, not a corporation. Obviously, if a DAO is in a public blockchain, if it's in a database, I don't think it's even a DAO because it's not decentralized and it's not autonomous. But if it's in a public blockchain, then the DAO will exist until either that blockchain ceases to exist and therefore the DAO stops existing as well, or if that blockchain just keeps existing. In the case of Aragon, it's any Ethereum virtual machine compatible blockchain, so that would be Ethereum or Ethereum Classic or other like Ethereum alternatives. If that blockchain keeps existing, then the DAO will exist basically forever. No one can seize it. And then also something important is that a DAO may evolve over time. So again, if we take the example of Bitcoin as a DAO, Bitcoin has had, or Bitcoin Core, or like Bitcoin clients in general, have had a bunch of updates and a bunch of like forks that have implemented functionality, but we still recognize Bitcoin as Bitcoin. So it is the same principle here. A DAO should be able to exist over time, and part of that is that it should be able to upgrade its components. And specifically in the Ethereum network, this is very important with smart contracts, because if you publish like a smart contract and you leave it there for 10 years, it will probably get drained because it will have like a vulnerability, or, well, this is like the conversation of it's called law, and sometimes it's just like, code should be law, but sometimes, we are humans, we commit mistakes, so we gotta upgrade the software over time. So one important characteristic of a DAO is that a DAO should be able to be recognized as the same DAO, even if you upgrade its components over time. And this DAO should be able to self-upgrade over time. So it shouldn't be any centralized party who says, this is the new version and that's it, because otherwise that's centralized. If you can push new versions of the code of a DAO, of the smart contracts of a DAO, then it becomes centralized. So there should be some way in which a DAO can self-upgrade. And in the case of Aragon DAOs, for example, you can go through a voting of the whole DAO to self-upgrade some of its components, some of its smart contracts. So you still maintain the same identity, but you upgrade it over time. DAOs own assets, and these assets are mainly digital assets. That's what they can own natively. But as we see a lot of assets that are kind of between the line of like digital and traditional systems, DAOs may also be able to own the stuff like real estate. If a token represents like some real estate to some extent. Obviously, DAOs prefer digital assets because like they are too native to their condition. So they prefer, specifically, like if it's a DAO on the Ethereum network, for example, it would prefer like ERC20 tokens because right now an Ethereum smart contract cannot own Bitcoin. But in general, like if we are able to build these bridges between different chains, a DAO may be able to own any digital asset, even without the Ethereum blockchain, such as Bitcoin. DAOs act, so DAOs basically can do proclamations. DAOs can interact with the outside world. So you may have a DAO that owns, as I said before, you can have a DAO that owns a token, or for example, like a CryptoKitty or whatever, and this DAO will be able to actually act on its own behalf and manifest its will to other parties. For example, it may be able to transfer this CryptoKitty to another different address, or it may be able to use transfer funds, or it may be able to do a lot of different things. And the DAO, it's an entity that can do it. It can act to the outside world. So if you have a smart contract that does something, for example, you have a smart contract which upgrades how a crypto protocol works. So let's say DAI, for example, in the case of MakerDAO, you have a stablecoin that has some parameters and works algorithmically. Then you may be able to have a DAO that acts in behalf of the whole like MakerDAO network and upgrades DAI to a new version. So DAOs can act and can take action. And finally, DAOs are governed. And I think the interesting part here is it can be humans who govern these DAOs, because the DAO may be programmed in a way that, for example, to take some decisions, you need to go through voting, and humans need to vote because humans are the ones that have tokens in this DAO. But they can also be machines, right? Because that's the cool thing about the blockchain. You can be a dog or you can be a fridge, and no one cares. So in general, a DAO is governed by someone. And then my favorite part of DAOs are the implications they have on the world. So DAOs completely break traditional legal systems. So we have, at Aragon, we have lawyers, I guess, such as everyone in the world, especially in the crypto space with everything that's happening. And when we talk lawyers about, like in our case, for example, we have the plan to transition a lot of the assets we raise in a token sale to the network. So the network of token holders can decide using a DAO how to spend them, because we believe that it's basically their assets and their capital and not necessarily ours. And when we tell lawyers we want to spend millions of dollars on a DAO, like we want to send some money to 0x, whatever, then it's funny because they start thinking about who is the counterparty that you are sending money to. Because when you sign a contract, you sign a contract with someone else. When you hire someone, you sign a contract with that someone who will provide services for you, and then you pay that someone else. And then I put them the example of networks like Bitcoin or Ethereum, where you pay a fee, and that fee goes to the network, and then the network, like the fee eventually goes to someone, right? Like eventually there is like a miner or like someone who receives that Ether or Bitcoin, and then they cash it out and they spend it off coffee, on tomatoes or whatever they have to buy. And that's probably like a person, like a human person. Although we don't know, right? But that may be a person. But in the meantime, then when you pay these fees, you don't really know who you're paying for. And it's kind of the same thing here. There is no liability. Like you're paying to this address, to this 0x123 whatever, and this address doesn't have a legal form whatsoever. It's just like there. But it has a form. It is an entity because it can act. It can do things. And I said before, it can do things in the digital realm. It can do things with digital assets. But also, as we know, like see a lot of tokens that represent things in the traditional world, for example, real estate, or even in the future, if we see like, political elections or political candidates raising money via token sales and then just being kind of a proxy that does whatever the DAO says, which I think would be super cool to have, then like that's it. You don't have anyone to point to with a real like traditional world name. So this completely breaks the legal system. Like I was told that when you get into learning about legal, or when you wanna get like a law degree, the first thing they tell you is what is a contract and what are the basic things that a contract has to have, and one of them is the counterparty. And here, well, there isn't. I mean, there is, but it is not even a person. So it breaks that. And the implications of breaking the traditional legal system are just like everything that we're used to do, everything that we are used to know about society, it's just broken. And then DAOs may be operated by machines as well. So that's interesting because when we think about voting, we think about someone like putting a piece of paper there which manifests their will for like a political election or something like that. So it's a very manual process, and sometimes you have in the traditional world, well, always you have like KYC. You need to know that you are you who are voting, and you are a citizen of whatever state. In this case, DAOs can be pseudonymous, and they are actually pseudonymous by default. So you don't have that property. And the interesting part is voting can be automated. So something that we want to build inside our roadmap, which is called the Aragon network, is this digital jurisdiction. So this digital jurisdiction is a legal system with a constitution, and this constitution implements some human rights that the DAO that represents the Aragon network agrees to. And then there's a court. And this decentralized court is just like a court made of pseudonymous identities who have a skin in the game to be judges and to resolve disputes in this court. So basically what you have here is something similar to a court, but instead of like a traditional court with how slow it is and probably corrupt in some countries and how outdated the legal system is, you have a court that is native to the blockchain world. So when you enter into an agreement via a smart contract, apart from what the smart contract says, which we all know that smart contracts and code is law is great for many use cases, but doesn't work for others. For example, subjective stuff, like for example, I'm hiring a contractor to finish off a website, and then I don't like the design that the contractor made. Like stuff that is very human. It's very hard for a smart contract to know, and it's definitely not something that you can fetch on the blockchain state. So for stuff like that, we're building this court, which will resolve disputes in a purely decentralized manner and pseudonymous manner. And the interesting part is when you think about these systems, you think about courts in the traditional sense. So you have like a judge who is judging, and you have like this process in this room and with lawyers, and takes like years. The cool thing here is you may have judges who are pseudonymous and are voting on who is the winner or the loser on a case. But then once you have enough precedents in the cases that happen inside the network, you may be able to train a machine learning algorithm. And then after having that machine learning algorithm look for all the past evidence in this digital court, you may be able to have a machine that votes for you as a judge on what's right and what's wrong. So then you have something that is voting for you, it's representing you in a pseudonymous network, and that can be just fully automated. That can be machines who actually do this for you. I think it's very similar to like Bitcoin again, or Ethereum, blockchains. Like right now, if you each computation that happens on a blockchain, or each Bitcoin transaction, we don't have humans who are verifying it and doing the math manually. We rely on machines to do that. And I think it will happen the same with voting. So eventually, because there are a lot of also concerns about DAOs in terms of, is there going to be super low participation on DAOs? And the answer is probably yeah. People usually, they don't care. They may not have skin in the game. But if we implement systems that rely on machines to vote for them on a lot of issues, then participation skyrockets. And we can do this because these systems, they are pseudonymous. We don't really care if 0x is a person or 0x123 is a machine. So that's also, for lawyers, that kind of breaks completely the model, because the liable party is a machine or an algorithm. So then it blows their mind. Also, DAOs are a very cool way to solve the commons. So something that we have seen over the past 20 years is the consolidation of very big corporations that are advancing technology. And they are advancing technology by creating technology such as Google, the search engine. Like for some places, Google is the internet, basically, because they have accumulated so much technological advancement that basically, like, you can interchange the two words, internet and Google. Some people may agree. There seems like a confusion between like what a search engine and a browser is. And then you have companies such as Apple or Facebook who are doing the same in their fields. So you have this rapid progress in technology which has happened, and then you have these companies who are accumulating all of that wealth themselves. And then you have stuff like Bitcoin or Ethereum, which have given the opportunity to like millions of people to invest in this technology evolution that has also happened in the last 10 years. And then obviously the establishment gets very mad at this, because for the first time, people can actually invest in technological revolutions and own them, which didn't happen before with these companies who were like publicly traded, or like, not even publicly traded, but just offered to like a few VCs who were able to invest. But with DAOs, we actually have a pretty good spot between the old model, which is a group of people, such as, for example, a team of like 2 or 3 startup founders raising money via VC, and basically raising money because of their reputation, because their reputation was at stake and their trust was at stake. It was a very high trust system, and then you go expanding that in different like funding rounds until like you go public, and then you're subject to a lot of different like also like trust laws by the nation states. And the other way around, which is you just put money into something that has no legal security at all. With DAOs, we can reach a sweet spot in which smart contracts guarantee the trust that couldn't be guaranteed in other form. But all the participants, all the in the traditional world, they could be founders. They are pseudonymous, so they don't need to reveal their identities. So basically, I think that the next Apples, Google, Facebooks of the world should be decentralized, of course, but should also be owned by a DAO. And it should be owned by a DAO, which is very easy for people to access and to opt in and to buy into that DAO. Because otherwise, we are going to have all of these technological advancements just owned by a few companies again, and then we know what happens with these systems. The good thing about DAOs, and I think actually the coolest thing is, if you wanted to organize before in the traditional world, you need to rely on the nation state. So if you want to create a company, you have to go to the company registry, and then you pay some money, and they do you the favor of creating some piece of paper that says you own that company, and then you can operate in the traditional world. You can create a bank account. You can do all of these things. You can use the legal system, which gives you a strong guarantees on how your company is going to work and stuff like that. And the good thing about DAOs is you don't need nation states for that anymore, because, well, for one, you can just create a DAO in 30 seconds. Like it's so easy, and for like $2 or $3 at today like Ethereum prices. And also, like these DAOs, they are on a blockchain, so you don't need to pay them taxes every year for whatever you are doing if you don't want to. And these DAOs, they just totally destroy the monopoly and governance that the nation state used to have. If you see nation states in the past, they don't only control how you organize at the macro scale with politics and elections and a lot of these things, but they also micromanage how you operate at the micro level. So when you create a company with just like another founder or another friend, the government is micromanaging how you create that. It's micromanaging what is the structure you have to create. Is it a joint stock company? Is it like a non-profit? And you have probably a couple more options, and that's about it. You cannot do like tailor-made organizations. And with DAOs, you can. And that is the emergence of organizations or communities that do not follow the traditional company model of like joint stock. They're totally different. They can be communities. They can be just like smart contract systems that do just one thing very well. You can fundraise. And actually, this takes me to the other point, which is ICOs and all of that. There's been a lot of trouble and bad press about ICOs raising hundreds of millions of dollars. And the issue there, I believe, is not that they are raising hundreds of millions of dollars, is that they are doing so in a centralized way. There is like 2, 3, 4 people that control the funds, and that's an issue. Basically, I think destroying the government's monopoly on governance means that we can safely raise hundreds of millions of dollars or even billions of like real amounts of capital and have a network control it. So not a centralized party control it. Because, I mean, let's look at it. Money flowing from the traditional system into cryptocurrencies, it's only good. The thing is, we got to make sure those assets are controlled by a network and not just like a couple of individuals to make sure it's purely decentralized and not something in between. So I think the DAOs are very interesting from a cypherpunk point of view, but also generally speaking about technology, they are so important because we do not want the next wave of companies or technological advancements to be owned by a few companies. We have seen that with Facebook, Google, Apple. It's just not working, and it's not improving the world at the rate we see improving the world. And so how do we get there, right? So I think that there are 2 different ways. You can create a DAO from scratch, and I think that's the best way to do things, just because interfacing the old traditional system with the new one, it's so hard that we saw before. It's very hard to turn a company into a DAO and still retain the legal status of a company in the traditional world, and lawyers may kill you because it's just so hard for them to understand. And even if they do understand it, like it's just the legal framework, they are not compatible. You cannot upgrade, that's it. And so there may be ways in which you can interface both, but if you just want to create a DAO from scratch, it's going to be way easier than trying to interface the legal system with the new digital-based system. So how do you become a DAO? So there are some methodological decisions you need to make. So for example, radical transparency. I believe at the micro level, when you are an individual, kind of my mantra is that privacy is great at the micro level and transparency is great at the macro. So if you are a DAO, and as I said before, you are raising hundreds of millions of dollars to do something, for example, to create open source software to compete against Google, Apple, or even hardware, you want to be transparent about how you spend money, because otherwise no one is going to trust you. Here you don't have persons who you can put into jail. You cannot sue anyone. And if you cannot take them into jail. You cannot literally like have someone going at their door with a gun and take them to jail, which I believe is fantastic. But we just have to be really conscious about how these things work. So you wouldn't want to put hundreds of millions of dollars into a DAO in which just like a single person can withdraw all the money and do whatever they want without any transparency. So you really do want transparency at the macro level. And how this looks like is you have to document everything either manually or automatically. So as we saw in the first couple of slides with like how a DAO looks like, if we went to the finance app there in the DAO, we could see all the transactions, and they are basically like smart contract made transactions. So if you withdraw money from the DAO, that record is there forever. Like you can see the record that you withdraw 5 ETH from this address to this other address, and that's it. However, until you get to be a DAO, for example, what we are doing at Aragon is if you go to transparency.aragon.org, you can see how we are spending each ETH that we raise in the token sale. So you can see here, and also the blockchain is just amazing for that because you can literally click there and go to the actual transaction in which those funds were moved. And if you even want to get further, you can have the addresses, the recipients, prove that it's them, just using some, like public-private key system. You also want transparency from the contributors working in your DAO. So in our case, we have a check-in channel in our Rocket Chat community in which like core contributors can just go on a weekly basis and say what they did for Aragon during last week. It's permissionless. Even if you are not like a core contributor or a usual contributor, you can still post there what you did for the DAO or for the community in this case. Then you will have a decentralized token supply. I think one thing is retaining a small percentage of tokens that you sell in a token sale for funding development. And one different thing is just selling like 3% of your token supply for like hundreds of millions of dollars. I think that doesn't make any sense at all, because if you just want to implement some governance structure, it makes it very difficult if you own, or if a single legal entity owns, more than 50% of the tokens, for example. I think even more than 25 or something like that, it starts to be very, very dangerous. So this kind of obvious and common sense, but if you want your project to be decentralized and you want to give voting power to your token holders, do not own most of the tokens. Then also, I think something that we are doing wrong is trying to build these decentralized projects, just having a single team working on them. So in the previous era, you would have companies like Apple who would hire people until they are like, hundreds of thousands of employees. And that works for them because they are building something that is purely centralized. It's a company, and the company is the canonical version of their vision. But in this case, with decentralized projects, you want to be as decentralized as possible. So what that means is, instead of having a centralized team and hiring a bunch of people, you may want to have multiple teams that are more independent and that are smaller, and you may want to fund them. So in our case, the journey into becoming a DAO is that the legal entity we used to raise the funds in the token sale is giving grants to different teams. And so Aragon 1 is the team that I work for, but also there is the Aragon DAC, and we will shortly open applications for other teams to use, come in and apply, and say how they are going to help the Aragon community and the Aragon network, and they will receive grants. And even like this couple of teams here, we are so different. Like this team here, the DAC, is kind of a bounty-based project, so you can come in, come out. It is kind of a DAC, a decentralized autonomous. In their case, they are kind of a non-profit, so they're like a decentralized autonomous community, and you can go there, claim some bounty, and that's it. Or you can be like a core contributor. In the case of Aragon 1, it's like a traditional for-profit entity in which you have like a very small team that is full-time, and everyone is kind of a core contributor. So they are wildly different, yet we want to fund them both because, as I said before, it's just better to have like 5 different teams working on something versus having a single one. I'm a fan of how, well, obviously Bitcoin has this from the beginning because Satoshi was wise enough to just, not even create a legal entity or something like that. It was just like, I create this, now buy, and you figure out how to maintain it. And then you have like 5 different companies or who have like core contributors working on it, but it's kind of permissionless, and no one has an unfair advantage. Whereas with other systems or other platforms like Ethereum, in Ethereum you do have an Ethereum Foundation, which employs a lot of people. And then you have other companies like Parity, but if you think about who is kind of the primary or main team, that's Ethereum Foundation, because they were the ones raising funds for the Ethereum protocol and the ones that invented it. So in order to avoid that scenario in which you have an entity that has an unfair advantage, it's just better to gradually kill this first entity which raised the funds and just give money to these other teams until you eventually dissolve down this first legal entity that raised the funds, and then it's purely decentralized. Just like Bitcoin it is today, no one has an unfair advantage. As I said before, like minimal legal entities. So if possible, if you can create a DAO from scratch, it's better because you don't have to go through all this hassle of winding down a previous legal entity that you created. But it's kind of hard sometimes because if you think about, for example, trademarks, I think someone owns the Bitcoin trademark, for example, and there are a lot of patents on Bitcoin and stuff like that. Not that they can do anything because it's a purely decentralized network, but how does a network, how does a DAO own a trademark in the traditional world? And the answer today is it can't. So something we are still trying to figure out is right now we have this legal entity which owns the trademarks for Aragon. How do we decentralize that so the whole network is the one owning the trademarks? And right now, our closest answer, and I will get into that in a few minutes, it's basically that the network should have power to vote on new versions of the legal documents of this legal entity. So that's kind of the way you interface the two. If you don't have to deal with trademarks or anything related to like the traditional legal system, just go pure DAO. That's the easiest. Then you have technical decisions. So community governed funds, right? As I was talking before, we want to create a DAO and give it funds that we raise in the token sale to see how people use them. And you may think that there is a lot of danger in that, but honestly, I think if you start with small amounts and then, like, for example, you retain some centralized bit of power in the beginning, and then you just, like, you know, see how it goes, and then you eventually remove that bit of power and you just give the community the whole power to control funds, and there you have it. So it's not that hard to just try. Then also, you have smart contracts that need to be upgraded, and a lot of a current pattern that I'm seeing in the Ethereum space is that you have contracts that are upgradable by only owner, which is basically use a single Ethereum address. So you have a decentralized system that then has like a you know, a fallback or a backdoor in which someone can just swap it out for a new smart contract. That may be, you know, like good in the beginning if you are not sure about where this is going, or you're not sure about some attack vectors, if you let your community upgrade it, but you just have to be very clear about that. If it's upgradable by only owner, it's a centralized system. It is not decentralized. And then also, I just want to go into this real quick. We founded this project called Pando, which basically creates DAO-governed Git repos. So you can have Git repos. Well, it's not exactly Git. They build their own versioning system. But you can have repos that are governed by a DAO. So this opens two things. This opens you know, canonical agreements or canonical versions of code that are agreed upon a huge network of stakeholders. So basically, you may have the whole Ethereum network or Bitcoin network voting on what is the next version of Bitcoin Core, what is that code base. And second, you enable open source sustainability, because you can programmatically have a protocol that rewards developers who are merging pull requests or are core maintainers. And you can reward them programmatically by minting new tokens in your platform. So I think every crypto protocol should have a pool of funds that are either minted or they're from like their token set if they did one, in which you can reward developers for their work. And this is perfect because you can have this decentralized system. And also what this offers is you can have fully automated builds of software that are deterministic. From the moment you push some code to the moment you have the binary. And that's perfect for security, and we don't have that right now. And then, just to finish up, something we've been working on, actually John, who's here, has been working on this, is AGP0, which is our proposal for basically what we have now as the Aragon project, starting to transition it into a DAO. So you have like budget proposals, so the DAO can spend money. You have meta proposals that change kind of the constitution of how this DAO can change itself. And then you have proclamations. So can this DAO signal that, for example, it's in favor of this hard fork or of this EIP, or like, you know, some signal, for example, the Aragon network does not support Donald Trump, stuff like that. And then repo, which is this DAO controls a code base, which in our case would be the Aragon code base. And then the stakeholders here can control who are the core maintainers, who has like push access to this repo, what is the canonical version of the Aragon core client that users are going to download. And then, well, treasury, which is basically like you may have a treasury which is hedged against like different crypto assets, and then move that down to the budget, which will be like the hot wallet of the DAO, to say so. And basically that's it. I think that was an overview of what are DAOs, the current state, and also some steps that you can do today to start transitioning towards being a DAO. So we are making a lot of work on this direction and researching a lot of possible ways. And DAOs are just so exciting because, as I said before, like it's the first time in humankind that we can freely organize and no one owns the monopoly of human governance and organization. And that's why DAOs are so important. So that's it. Thanks, everyone.
We have first question in here. Maxim, please.
Thank you for a nice talk. Yeah, decentralization is important, but decentralization is a really hard thing. And I have quite a complex question of several parts. Actually, when you're talking about voting rights and so on, that in fact implies that there will be a majority dictatorship over the minority. And one of the solutions to this problem is the market mechanism, when you can split and follow with the market rules, so a minority always have their own version and go by their old rules. And coming back, that was the case of the DAO was trying to implement, and it failed because decentralization is hard, and they built their own smart contracts on a Turing-complete state machine, which is really hard to predict how it will behave in case of bugs. And the Aragon, as far as I know, is built on top of Ethereum, the same system. And once again, it became the single point of failure in terms of decentralization, because you depend on the future of Ethereum network, in fact. So maybe, did you look into some other ways of reducing the risks related to this part of the story? So basically coming from the regulation, splitting organizations in parts, and decentralizing on the level of base technology. How you can comment that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the first part, just to back up and explain that a little bit. So when you have a DAO, it is kind of different from a blockchain in the sense that when you fork a blockchain, all the balances are kept in this new fork of the chain as well. And whatever this new chain or this new token in this chain is worth, that's another question. But you have balances that are basically split and replicated. In the case of a DAO, you will have to encode the DAO in a way that you can have this split functionality, which I think is super important for a minority to use fork and be able to for example, retain their percentage of the treasury of a DAO. So I think that's super important. As for the Ethereum network, right now the smart contracts are compatible with any Ethereum virtual machine blockchain. So obviously, there is a huge vector attack, as you said. There are trade-offs in terms of you have this Turing-complete virtual machine which can do a lot of this stuff. You wouldn't be able to have these customizable DAOs that are self-upgradable and can do a million different things. Because also with Aragon, you can create your own apps that are plugged into the DAO. So you may wanna swap out your voting app with a liquid democracy app or a footarchy app or whatever. So that's a lot of flexibility that we couldn't have before. On the other hand, obviously, you're risking losing funds because of a smart contracts. So what we have done in there is, well, basically, the smart contract that owns assets, the vault, is a very, very, very simple smart contract. And obviously, you can do audits, you can do a lot of these things, which reduce the possibility of bugs like this happening. You may also have bugs in the client, like in the Ethereum client, which is a very complex, state machine as well. So there's a lot of possible systemic risk. I think, well, such as, 20 years ago, people were worried about computers too, because they introduced the same level of complexity. And now where we are now, we don't really think about that. Just computers work and that's it. So I think we will go through the same in terms of how Ethereum developer tools are improving, and I think they're improving quite a lot. Then there is another angle, which is smart contract insurance. I think that will be a thing, and that will be huge, because when you enter into a smart contract agreement, you also want the developer, or I will feel more comfortable if the developer is offering me some insurance in case the smart contract breaks. So when you go into an agreement, if you just want to make sure that whatever happens, you have some collateral or some stake that you can claim via some dispute resolution from the developer or from this insurance pool, you should be able to do that. And I think that's super important. And something that we want people to be building on top of the Aragon network, on top of this decentralized court.
So basically, when you're saying that there are other implementations of EVM, like for instance, we can take a rootstock, so the Aragon network can be deployed there. But the tokens that represent the value and voting rights and many other things, they can't be shared between different implementations. So it basically will be a fork, not supported by the Aragon community initially because of these technological limitations. Did you thought about that? Yeah,
so we've been thinking about how to implement the Aragon network in a cross-chain way. So just to back up a little bit, Aragon DAOs, they don't depend on any other DAO, they are self-sovereign. But if you want to opt in into the Aragon network, into this digital jurisdiction for DAOs, they will be able to do so. We have been thinking about how to make the Aragon network cross-chain using oracles. So you may have, there are some oracles projects, like for example, Witnet, who are working on generalized oracles. So a blockchain may be able to read the state of another blockchain using this network. And then what you can have is you can have the Aragon network deployed across 5 different chains, and you can have chain A checking what is the state of a bot in chain B and C and reacting to that. So they are basically reacting to what's happening on the other chains in which the network is deployed and creating a new state based on that. So basically they will all have the same state as some given point in time. Obviously you will have to have some chaining with the tokens with value R, and you can withdraw them and like they are on exchanges and stuff like that. And that's a centralization point of failure, which is basically exchanges. But you could always have some tokens in chain B and then move them to chain A and then withdraw them from there. But that's kind of super experimental research phase still. A good question.
I'm sorry, there was one guy before you.
Hello, Luis. Nice talk. I want to point out a few problems that we may encounter if we take anonymity or pseudonymity as an absolute truth for DAOs. One is, for instance, how can you make sure that a DAO doesn't become an AO? Because if you don't know who the token holders are, it can be the same organization buying tokens from different addresses, and then you have just one institution deciding the future of the DAO. Another problem is if you mentioned that DAOs can own property. So imagine that you have a DAO that owns a patch of land and people are living there. How do you think the courts are going to resolve crimes on the flesh? And how can you deal with that if you stick to anonymity?
Well, for the first part, that's a very important challenge, which is in a pseudonymous system, you are not sure of the percentage of people that are owning some other percentage of tokens. So I think that's very common to all crypto systems in general. And I think the best we can do is use like build systems that are easily adopted by people from a UX standpoint. So people use them, and we have like millions of people that are using them versus use a few. I don't really have like a final answer to that. And for the other one, a piece of land owned by a DAO in which there are some crimes and then they need to be resolved in a, in a traditional legal system, I think that will be until we have pieces of land in the world which are in parallel legal systems, that will be the case. Like a piece of land owned by a DAO, it's kind of the same as of a piece of land owned by you or me. If they are in a jurisdiction and there is a law in that jurisdiction, then they would be subject to that courts and to those laws.
Are you an anarchist?
I am.
Yeah. Good. Could you define which kind of anarchist are you?
I was, like, when I went into Bitcoin in 2011, I defined myself as cryptoanarchist, and then no one was calling themselves like that. And I looked like a freak, but now like I'm just so happy that it's kind of generalized. And I mean, I kind of feel that you have to be an anarchist to be here. So.
Hi, great talk, thanks. So one of the conversations that's going on in the Ethereum ecosystem at the moment regarding blockchain governance is the potential for, let's say, blockchains on the autonomous side of things to become weaponized. So if that's the case, what's your read on the potential for DAOs to become weaponized, to be used for social bad rather than social good?
Yeah, thanks. Good question. I think this is kind of the same as the internet. I'm just trying to draw parallels to like 20 years ago because I think it's very similar. The same way we shouldn't put Tim Berners-Lee into jail because he invented a system in which there is child pornography, I think we shouldn't put developers in a position where they are liable for everything that is built with this software. So I think generally DAOs can be used for anything. Same as a knife can be used for anything too. I think there is a second twist to that though, which is base protocols like Ethereum should be neutral. They should allow for DAOs to be used for anything. But then we can build some opinionated protocols on top of Ethereum, for example, such as the one we're trying to build with the Aragon network. And the Aragon network will be opinionated. It will have some constitution, which will probably be very thin, and we'll just talk about human rights. And if you abuse and you go against that, then the network may be able to slash your stakes and also kick you out of the network. So I think as we build these opinionated systems, more and more people will opt in into them, and we will be able to enforce some basic human rights or stuff like that onto that. But I think neutral protocols like Ethereum, in which you can do anything, are super important.
Okay, just a quick follow-up. If there was, say, another contentious event in, let's say, the Ethereum network, and there was another contentious hard fork leading to a chain split, what would be your read on the perceived outcomes for some of the DAOs that live on top of those networks?
That's very interesting, yeah. So if the Ethereum network forks, you may have two different DAOs, and then each DAO should decide what is the good one, right? But that's up to the DAOs, to the individual DAOs, which are still sovereign.
So Bitcoin is trying to solve a specific trust problem, which is people don't trust central banks to keep the supply of money low enough to avoid inflation. Are DAOs also trying to solve a trust problem? And if so, who are the parts involved? Who is not trusting whom? Yeah,
I think DAOs can be used to solve trust problems, but you can also create a DAO with a couple of friends and which you trust and use it for efficiency, for example. But I think DAOs, in the most pure sense, are trying to solve the problem of trust, and I will put you an example. As I was saying before, I don't think the problem is with token sales raising hundreds of millions of dollars. I think the problem is with raising that amount in a centralized manner. If you raised some money to build open source software, and you can raise it in a way that the community can vote on whether a milestone was achieved or not, and if it's achieved, you can release the next chunk of money for those core teams, then you're solving a problem of trust, and you can build a lot of open source software without the need of trusting in the people that are actually building it. Another example, actually with Pando, is that you may be able to fund open source software in a way that wasn't possible before, because you can have a community having governance over who are the core maintainers, who are the core contributors, and you have this system of checks and balances everywhere with different voting mechanisms and different communities that can vote for different things. So for example, if I'm a user, I may vote on who are the maintainers of the software. And so I'm funding these maintainers if they do the right job. If they don't, they are kicked out. So that's a problem of trust also. You can basically build a lot of things, and DAOs basically are a way in which you can carry out ideas and missions without necessarily having to trust everyone that is involved in that process. The same way you don't have to trust miners in Bitcoin.
I'm sorry, I will bring you a microphone because we are streaming live. So I would like to have your question clearly to sound there.
So I was just saying, so basically the problem of trust here is that the investors don't trust the board of the company or the CEO of the company. That's the problem of trust is being solved by DAOs.
That's one example. Like DAOs may be used for anything. For example, mesh networks. Like right now there's a project building mesh networks with DAOs. And the good thing is you have mesh networks that are owned by a community. And so you may have this community decide, for example, who are the trustworthy nodes that are going to be in this mesh network. So it really solves any trust problem in which there is some governance involved, some community governance involved.
I'm sorry, guys, we are out of time, but maybe John would like to tell something to make it clear. Yeah.
Another way that I think about it is like Bitcoin solves the trust for individuals with a monetary system. DAOs now give organizations the ability to not have to trust banks or governments with monetary supplies. So it's good for individual accounts are good for individuals. DAOs are good for organizations. But the blockchain is essentially solving the same trust problem, which is you don't have to trust a bank or a government with control of the money.
Cool. Okay, guys, thank you for discussion. I think you have more and more questions. You can discuss it with Luis or maybe with John later. And I'm sorry we are out of time because next speaker would like to prepare. So please, one more thanks to Luis Cuende from Aragon 1. And you can stay here for another speech in, at 6, I'm sorry. It will be streamed here and everywhere. I'm sorry. Nassim Nicholas Taleb via Skype. And if not, we will see all of you in DEF CON, I think. That's 4th year of conference. We are 5th year, just saying, you know. But anyway, see you there. Thank you.